last time, this is where we left off. And what we're basically saying with Modigliani and Miller, Proposition 1, is in a world without, bless you, in a world without taxes, that you cannot increase the value of the firm simply by taking on debt. So, remember we said that the value of the firm is the B plus S or D plus E. It's just the equity and the debt added together. And no matter how you slice that up, it's always just going to be worth the value of the firm's underlying assets. It doesn't matter how you finance it. Now, spoiler alert, we said this is true without taxes. What do you think is going to happen when we start throwing taxes in there? We're going to start to see some differences, right? Okay, so that's Modigliani and Miller, Proposition 1. Now, Proposition 2 tells us the leverage increases the risk and return to stockholders. And let's go back and do some conceptual thinking on this. Do you guys remember this picture? So, when we had no debt, the slope of the EPS was like this. But when we start taking on debt, then the slope of the EPS does this. Anytime you start to see differences in how something does, so if something does better in good times and worse in bad times, that means it is riskier. If something does better in good times and worse in bad times, that means it's riskier than this plain Jane. So plain Jane here with no debt, that slope is relatively shallow. It gets steeper, but that's only good for you during good times. We see that the EPS is higher on a firm with debt in good times above that break-even point on EBIT. But below that point, are you pleased to have debt or would you rather have none? None. Yeah, you'd rather have none, right? And it's because of the fixed cost nature of debt financing. Right? We're going to owe that interest regardless. We talked about with the car payments. Do they care how much money you're making? No. You always have to make that car payment. So in a month when you're making a bunch of money, that car payment seems small. In a month when you're unemployed, that car payment seems huge. Does that make sense? What if you own your car? There's less risk there because you aren't going to miss a payment. Does that make sense? Okay, so we know that increasing the amount of debt in the capital structure increases the risk. Now let's talk about the different variables in here. R sub S is the required return on the stock or the required return on the equity. And remember that the equity is a residual claim. You get what's left over. Now, this formula that they've got up here has actually been derived from the weighted average cost of capital. If you took, do you guys remember weighted average cost of capital? If you take that formula and you get rid of the 1 minus T sub C, because after all, we're living here in a world without taxes, right? If you take that off, you can rearrange and come up with this formula. And we say that the R sub S, or the required return on the equity, is equal to R sub 0. By the way, that R sub 0 would be, in a world without taxes, the weighted average cost of capital. And here's why. The riskiness of the firm is the riskiness of the underlying assets. And that's what weighted average cost of capital is all about. It's about the riskiness of the underlying assets in a world without taxes, right? Okay, so in a world without taxes, R sub 0 and R WACC are exactly the same thing. R sub 0 here is the return on the unlevered equity. And then of course we've got B is the value of the debt, and S is the value of the equity. Are we talking book values or market values? We talked about this last time.
Market value.
Yeah, market values. And how do we get the market value of the equity?
Share price times the shares outstanding.
Yeah, share price times the number of shares outstanding. How do we get the market value of the debt? Mr. Sanders?
Is it just your payment that's left, or how much
No.
principal is left?
Swing and a miss. Okay, if I say bond, do you think debt or equity? Debt, very good. Do you think bonds have a price out in the market?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what we're going to do is find the market value of each bond that the company has, and we're going to add those all together. Now, it's not that we're going to go out and grab 1 million bonds and price them all individually, because they're typically bond issues that'll have 100,000 bonds or whatever. And so what we're going to do is take the number of bonds for each issue, multiply it by the price for those bonds, and then add all those together for all the issues of the firm, and that will give us the market value of the debt. Now, as far as an exam or homework goes, do you think I'm going to give you a company with 17 different issues of debt? No. No, we're going to keep this reasonable, but you need to understand that's how this works. Okay, then let's see, what else we got here? So let's look at B over S. What is another name for B over S? I'll give you a hint. It's the blank to blank ratio.
Debt to equity.
Yeah, it's a debt to equity ratio. So you already recognize that. And R sub B is the required return on the debt. R sub B is the required return on the debt. By the way, good formula once again to have on your note sheet. Any questions before we move forward? Yeah.
For the note sheet, can we like label what each letter means?
Oh, sure. Hey, folks, you can write, of course, it has to be handwritten. You can write anything you want on that note sheet. You can write it as small as you want. You can highlight, you can make a rainbow flag with your highlighter. I don't care. Here's what I don't want. I don't want computer-generated note sheets. Any idea why I don't want a computer-generated note sheet?
You didn't study it.
Yeah, because you guys would, Mr. Stiff would create one. He's like, hey guys, did you like the note sheet? And you're all like, yeah! And you don't know squat. By the way, why do I even let you have a note sheet? Because when you build a note sheet, that's when you learn, right? Okay, now the other thing I don't want to see on the note sheet is 1 through 40, A, B, D, because first of all, I'm going to think, how in the world did you manage to get that? Because two things. Number one, the exam is 40 multiple choice questions. Each question is drawn from a pool of like 4 questions. And so there are like 256 million possible combinations. Additionally, the multiple choices are randomly scrambled. So there's no way to know A, D. And I explained this one time to a class, and I still had a guy come, and he had found an old copy of an old exam, and he just had the letters. I'm like, go right ahead, right? So what were the chances? He was gonna, on average, we would expect him to get what, 25% right? 20 to 25% with 4 to 5 multiple choices. Does that help you guys on your note sheet? Okay.
Curiosity, how did he end up doing it? I thought that's something.
Oh, he failed. He failed, I think, more than once. I think he went back to his home country without an MBA. Who knows? He's probably living with his parents. He's probably 40 years old and living with his parents now. By the way, that's not a goal, right? Don't make that a life goal for you. Okay. So let's do this graphical representation. So we've got these formulas we've already talked about, and that one we were just looking at is the required return on stock. And I want you to notice that this horizontal axis is the debt to equity ratio. So you could say it's the x-axis, and then up here in that formula where you see B over S, that's x. And so then your slope would be R sub 0 minus R sub B, and your y-intercept would be R sub 0. Am I speaking Spanish, or do you recognize terms like slope and y-intercept? Okay, very good. I sometimes have trouble with my MBA students, and they think algebra is just beyond them. So I'm glad you're picking up on this. Okay, so here's what we know. As the debt to equity ratio increases, the required return on the stock in a world without taxes increases in a linear fashion. So we got a straight line here. the more risky the more debt there is in the capital structure, the riskier the firm is, the higher the required return on the stock. Some people make a mistake and they think that they could just load up on debt and then the required return on the stock would stay the same and therefore they would have a lower overall cost of capital. That is absolutely the wrong way to think about it.
When talking about debt, we relate it to bonds, but why, where does a loan come into play?
Okay, so if you had a loan, then we would add that in with the debt. Now, it gets a little hairier when you start thinking about terms of the market value of the debt. Now, why do the price of bonds fluctuate? It's because interest rates or yield and maturity fluctuate. But what if I have a floating rate loan from the bank? The value of that loan remains fairly close to the face value, right? And so a lot of business debt is floating rate debt. The problem would come down if you had some sort of fixed rate debt through a bank. Then coming up with a valuation of that might be a little more difficult. But do you think I'm going to hit you with that during an exam?
I don't know.
Absolutely not. Okay, now let's think about the weighted average cost of capital here. I want you to notice that in a world without taxes, it stays exactly the same as the debt to equity ratio increases. And that is because that weighted average cost of capital in a world without taxes just represents the risk of the underlying assets. And so it doesn't matter how much debt you're going to throw onto the fire. What's going to happen is as you get more and more debt, the required return on that equity is going to go up and that WACC is going to stay the same. It's the value of the assets of an unlevered firm. It's always going to be the same. Once again, in a world without taxes. Okay, can anyone tell me, first of all, why is R sub B the same all the way across? R sub B, what does that stand for?
Interest rate isn't going to change.
Yeah, so on loans that I currently have outstanding, that interest rate isn't going to change. However, let's ask this question. If two people come to you asking for a loan and they are otherwise identical borrowers, one of them doesn't owe any money at all to anyone, and one of them owes money to everyone in town, which would you rather loan to?
First option.
Yeah, the first option, because they're more likely to be able to repay, right? Because every bit of their discretionary income could be used to pay down that debt. But what about the person that owes money to everybody in town? Yeah, one little hiccup in their cash flows and suddenly they're teetering on bankruptcy. I'll give an example. So my wife and I, we're both professors. We work for a state university. Do you think our cash flows are pretty reliable? Yeah, and they're also very steady. Now, across the street, oh, and by the way, the only thing we owe money on is our house, right? The cars are paid for, everything else is paid for. The only thing we owe money on is the house. Now, across the street, and this guy's since moved, so don't try to figure out who it is. He's since moved. He was a spine surgeon at Mercy. Do you know how those people get paid? Do you think they get a monthly salary? No, he got paid by the spine, right? In fact, that's why he was really miffed. He's like, they're not throwing me enough spines these days. And maybe people's backs are just healthier. Who knows, right? Now, let me tell you about this guy. He had a stay-at-home wife. Keep in mind, my wife works, right? Do you think it's better from a diversification standpoint to have two incomes or just one? Two. The second thing I'm going to tell you about is that he had probably $250,000 in student loan debt. And the third thing I'm going to tell you is his house probably cost around $150,000 more than mine did, and I guarantee you that he didn't put 20% down because he got there straight out of med school. Do you think people straight out of med school have 20% down to put down on a $500,000 house? No. Okay. Also, here's where it gets crazy. he had a brand new BMW M5. Do you guys know anybody know what that is? Is that a cheap car? No, man, that's an expensive car.
Cool.
Oh, it is cool. It's loud and it's fast. I loved it, right? But I would not have loved the payments, which I know he was making because he didn't have that kind of cash. Now, he also had 3 kids, and he's sending them to, what kind of school do you think they go to? Private school, right? Now, and by the way, he probably made more than my wife and me combined. However, if you were going to loan money to one of those 2 households, who would you loan it to? Yeah, Mr. Stability here with low debt. And so the point here is that R sub B, as you said, the interest rate is going to stay the same on existing debt agreements. But what about new ones? What about when you go out to borrow new money? It's going to go up because, remember, risk and reward have to go together. If you're going to loan money to riskier people, you have to charge them more. It always freaks students out when they first get into finance, and I tell them that you should charge poor people higher interest rates. And they're like, why? That's so terrible. And the answer is because they're riskier. Risk and reward have to go together. Does that make sense? Okay. So my point to you on that R sub B is, in the real world, that thing would probably have some little kind of a curve up on it. If just for theoretical purposes here, we're saying it's a straight line. Okay, now we're finally going to get into corporate taxes. In the United States, we do have corporate taxes, and corporate taxes in the U.S. are just like personal taxes in that they are progressive. What do we mean by progressive on taxes? I'll get you started. As you make more, your tax rate goes up, right? And so we got the same thing here with corporations, but for ease of simplicity and all that other kind of stuff, we're going to assume the same corporate tax rate for everyone. Are you with me so far? Okay. And so, Proposition 1, when we throw in these corporate taxes, something interesting happens. Remember, Proposition 1 with no taxes was that the value of the levered firm was equal to the value of the unlevered firm. But what we're going to say here with the Proposition 1 with taxes is that there is an adder. There's something that gets added on to that value of the unlevered firm. And so T sub C is the corporate tax rate. Does anyone remember what B stands for? It's the market value of the firm's debt. And so you might be saying, well, how the heck did they come up with this? That T sub C times B represents the present value of the firm's interest tax shield. It's the present value of the firm's interest tax shield. Remember last time I told you about the present value of a perpetuity. It looked like that. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we're going to find the present value of this tax shield, the first thing we're going to have to do is find the annual amount of money that we are saving as a result of doing this. And so how much are we going to be saving? Well, first of all, we've got to figure out how much is the interest that we're paying every year, because that's what we get to deduct from our taxes. And the amount of interest that we are saving, or that we're paying every year, is the required return on the bonds times the value of those bonds. Do you guys see that? If we take the interest rate times the face value of the bonds, that is how much interest we're paying every year. Now the next question is, how much does that save us on our taxes? Well, if we've got a 21% tax rate, then we are going to save 21% of that amount right there in taxes every year. And so it's really easy to figure out that the annual amount of money that we are saving is T sub C times R sub B times the amount of bonds. So this is the annual amount of interest multiplied by the tax rate. That is our annual tax savings. Now, all I have to do is divide by the required rate of return on that debt. Well, it's just R sub B. Something magical, though, happens. What happens? Oh, come on, it's really not magic, it's algebra. Mr. Stoner, what happens?
We're talking about like curvature or
This and this, what happens to these?
they cancel out?
Yeah, they cancel out. And so all we're left with is this T sub C times B. That is the present value of the interest tax shield, or the present value of the debt tax shield. Okay, now, there's something funky going on here, and this is one where I'm going to talk about implications. But here's one of the funky implications. How would I maximize the value of the levered firm? What could I do?
More debt?
Yeah, we just take on more debt. In fact, Modigliani and Miller suggest in this world, they're saying, well, wait a minute, just take on as much debt as you can. Now, you can't have 100% debt at a firm. Someone's got to own some equity, right? There's got to be an owner to the firm, but you would take on absolutely as much debt as you possibly can. Do you think that's what happens in the real world? No, and that's what we're going to discuss today after we get through the PowerPoints, is what's going on in the real world. Okay, so that's why Proposition 1, we see this value of the levered firm is equal just to the value of the unlevered firm plus the present value of that debt tax shield. Proposition 2, with corporate taxes, looks exactly like Proposition 1 with one difference. Do you see it?
Tax rate.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. It looks just like Proposition 2 with no taxes. The only difference is that 1 minus T sub C. And if you remember, I told you that that formula was actually derived from the weighted average cost of capital equation. In the weighted average cost of capital equation with taxes, do you recognize that 1 minus T sub C? It's the same darn thing. Okay, so now we have everything up there is the same as we talked about before without taxes, except for this 1 minus T sub C. Now let's talk about what that means. T sub C, by the way, do you think governments ever let you off with zero taxes? In this world, no. We're talking about T sub C being a fixed amount. They're going to charge taxes of some variety. And so that tax rate has to be somewhere above zero, but it has to be less than 1. Why do you think tax rates have to be less than 1?
If it was one, they'd tax everything that you got.
Yeah! Do you guys get that? What would be my incentive to go to work? Zero! Now, you guys might be freaking out and thinking, well, what happens in really high tax regimes? It's interesting. In the United States, in the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate was somewhere in the 95% range. I'm not kidding. Isn't that crazy? Of course, we had a war to pay for, right? We were paying off World War II. But eventually, John Kennedy, a Democrat, and Ronald Reagan, a Republican, figured out that this was a bad deal, and they both made changes to try to get that down to give people more incentive to work and to earn. There's got to be some sort of happy medium in there, right? Some optimal point. Do I think we've actually found the optimal? Absolutely not. But I do know this. Remember that it's got to be somewhere between 0 and 1. That means that 1 minus T sub 0, T sub C, 1 minus T sub C is something less than 1. Can you see that? For example, if we just say the tax rate is 20%, 1 minus 0.2 is 0.8. Is that less than 1? Yeah. Okay, so what are we saying here? The required return on the equity is always going to be lower in the presence of taxes. The required return on the equity is always going to be lower in the presence of taxes because that 1 minus T sub C thing is always less than 1. In a world without taxes, T sub C is equal to 0, and that thing collapses to 1, and so that's going to be the high boundary. But as your tax rate goes up, required return on the equity goes down, and that's because that tax shield is provided by the interest on the debt. Any questions before we move on? Okay, always helps to take a look at a picture. So here we go, the top line there, the top red line, is the required return on the stock in a world without taxes. It's the required return on the stock in a world without taxes. And then the next red line down is the required return on the stock in a world with taxes. And just as we predicted, it is lower than in a world without taxes, because that 1 minus T sub C is less than 1. Now I want you to notice that the horizontal axis here is still debt to equity ratio. It's bonds divided by stock or debt divided by equity. This is where things get funky. Remember, in a world without taxes, that RWAC was just a straight line all the way across. But now, because we have this tax shield of debt, when we plot this thing out here, something really weird happens. And that is, it's not a line, it's now a curve. And let's explain why that is. Remember that horizontal axis is debt to equity? The reason that those top two are lines is because you're multiplying the slope times the B over S, the debt to equity ratio. So it makes perfect sense that they're lines. But do you see the debt to equity ratio in the RWAC equation? It's not there. You have B over B plus S, which we refer to as the total debt ratio of the firm. That's just total debt divided by total assets. And you've got S divided by B sub B plus S, which is the, well, let's call it the total equity ratio, which is just total equity divided by total assets. By the way, those things always have to add to 1, right? What is, let's just look at debt the total debt ratio. What is the relationship between debt to equity and the total debt ratio? It turns out it's non-linear. What do I mean? Let's take a firm that has 1 debt and 1 equity. What is the debt to equity ratio there?
1.
1. And what is the total debt ratio? 1/2, right? Because we got 1 over 1 for debt over equity, 1 over 2 for debt over the total assets. Now, let's think, so now we've got a debt to equity ratio of 0.5. What if I take that 0.5 and I just jack that number up by 20% to get to 0.6 debt to equity ratio? So that's a 20% increase. Let's talk about what happens to the total debt ratio now. We've got 0.6 on top, but what do we have on bottom for debt? Sorry. I'm increasing the total debt ratio from 50% to 60%. So I'm going from 0.5 to 0.6. My total debt now, my total, so my debt weight is 0.6, my equity weight is 0.4, right? They always have to be. What's 0.6 divided by 0.4? What's 6 divided by 4? 1.5, very good. Okay, look at what happened here. We went from a 20% increase in the total debt ratio actually is implied into a debt to equity ratio of 50% increase, right? We call that a non-linear response to changes in debt. So debt to equity has a non-linear response versus the total debt ratio. And so that's why we see this line being not really a line, but a curve instead. So don't let that freak you out. Now, what can we take away from looking at this curve? Do you remember, well, we've previously talked about diminishing returns. When we were looking at the shoe companies, we said a lot of these things, that the more you spend, you still get benefit, but you get less additional benefit for each extra dollar that you spend. Do you remember that? Okay, it turns out that there is diminishing improvement in the weighted average cost of capital as we increase here. In the very beginning, as we increase the debt to equity ratio, you get a lot of benefit. But as you go further and further out, that improvement gets smaller and smaller, right? What would we rather have, a higher WACC or a lower WACC? Yeah, and so what we're seeing here is that this WACC kind of improves as we go further out on this debt to equity ratio, but then it becomes asymptotal. What does asymptotal mean? What's an asymptote?
It's the lines that never quite touch.
Yeah, so if I have two curves, or if I have a curve that does this, and it's getting closer and closer and closer to the line, but it never quite touches, that's called an asymptote. So this thing becomes asymptotal. And so in the beginning, you're going to see a lot of benefit from adding additional debt to your capital structure. The further out you get, the less benefit you see. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's look at this using our cash flow numbers. And remember, the EBIT to all these firms are exactly the same, regardless of how they're financed, regardless of how we have taxes, because it's earnings before interest and taxes. Okay, so in an all equity firm, how much interest are we paying? None. Remember that zero debt gives us zero interest that we have to pay. And so all of that EBIT flows to EBT, which is pre-tax income. And that's what we're going to figure our taxes based on. And here we're assuming a 21% tax rate. And so my taxes in recession are 210. In the kind of normal times, it's 420. And in times of expansion, it's 630. Have I blown your mind yet? I sure hope not, right? Because we're just looking at 21% of 3,000 there at the end gives us 630. Now, in an all equity firm, all of the investors are shareholders. And so where does all that money after taxes go to? Who does it go to? It goes to the shareholders. And so the total cash flow to the investors is the same as the total cash flow to the shareholders. And so we just take our EBT minus our taxes, pre-tax income minus taxes, gives us that cash flow to the shareholders. And in recession, we've got 790. In normal times, we've got 1,580. And in really good times, we have 2,370. Once again, all that money goes to the shareholders. They are the only investors in the firm. Okay. Now, let's take a look at what happens when we throw in debt. And this is the same as the example that we used earlier. It's a $20,000 firm, and they're going to borrow $8,000 to buy back some shares. And so now the equity is going to be $12,000, the debt's going to be $8,000. They're borrowing at 8%. And so to find out the annual amount of interest, we're going to take that 8% times the $8,000. It's going to give us $640. And so now I'm going to take EBIT minus that interest to get to EBT, or pre-tax income. And down here in recession, that interest almost eats up the EBIT, right? And all that you're left with there is $360. Now, we've got to still pay taxes on that. 21% of 360 is $75.60. And so we can take that 360 minus 75.6, it gives us 284.40. I want you to circle that 284.40 and right beside it, shareholders, SH, shareholders. And so the shareholders previously were getting 790 in recession, and now they're getting $284.40. But of course, they own a smaller portion of the firm too, right? Okay, but who are the other investors in the firm at this point? Yeah, the bondholders. How much are the bondholders getting? 640. And so we're going to add the 640 plus the 284.40 together, and that tells us $924.40 is flowing to the investors. If we look at this thing from the standpoint of just purely the investors, are we better off for having taken on the debt? Yeah, bless you. And the reason is because we had this interest rate, or this interest tax shield. Now, we could actually do this using the tax shield approach, which hopefully you learned in 380, and you talked about it again in 390. We could actually just take the earnings before interest and taxes and multiply it by 1 minus T sub C. And then just add the tax shield that we get from the debt, which is the tax rate times the required return times the amount of debt that we've got. So it's just this piece right here. Keep in mind that this thing we're looking at right now is on an annual basis, and this thing over here is the present value of all the future cash flows. So that's why we don't have to divide by R sub B up here in this one, because we're not getting the present value. Okay, now what does that tell us? It tells us that the more debt we take on, in theory, what happens to this cash flow to the investors?
Gross.
Yeah, it's going to go up. Does that make sense? Okay. Whew. Now let's take a look at these numbers. We see that the shareholders actually do worse in all the situations, but they are owning a smaller portion of the firm, so it absolutely makes sense. But remember, we said that maximizing the value of the firm was actually the same as maximizing shareholder wealth. And when we can increase these cash flows to the investors, what do you think that does to the value of the firm? Yeah, it's going to increase it, right? And we're getting back to what we said earlier, that the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the unlevered firm plus T sub Z times B. As B goes up, the value of the levered firm goes up. Okay. Now, once again, does that mean that I should go out and take on a bunch of debt? No, and we're going to get to that in a bit, why that's not a smart idea. Now, why does this work? Well, so far, we've been dividing this pie between shareholders and debt holders. And in a world without taxes, that makes all the sense in the world. But whenever you go into business, regardless of whether you're all equity or you're a mixture of debt and equity, there's always someone else in the hot tub with you. Who's first in line for any sort of cash flows at the firm? The government, right? It's standing there with their hands out wanting taxes. And so instead of looking at this pie being a combination of debt and equity, we should look at the pie being divided up between, and this is the annual cash flow pie, being divided up between the debt holders, the equity holders, and the government. And here's what you need to understand. In an all equity firm, how much is this tax shield? If it's all equity, how much is B? Zero. In an all equity firm, there is no tax shield, therefore we're going to pay full taxes. However, as we start to add in debt, that tax shield increases. As the tax shield increases, what happens to the share of taxes, or the share of our cash flows that the government gets? It gets smaller and smaller. And so the reason that this tax shield, or that the leverage increases firm value, isn't because of the magic of debt, it's because of this tax shield that it gives us that allows us to pay less in taxes. And so certainly debt plus equity in the right-hand picture adds up to more than just equity in the left-hand picture. Can you guys see that? Okay. By the way, should you feel bad about avoiding paying taxes? Mr. Stoner, what would be a situation in which I should feel bad about avoiding paying taxes? Let's ask Mr. Stith, he's our ethics expert. What's the line?
Avoidance is good, evasion is bad.
Very good. Avoidance is good. We're going to do it legally, right? We're going to use every aspect of the law conservatively to minimize our tax burden. For example, every year I write off my personal taxes, I write off my charitable contributions, I write off my mortgage interest, and I write off my state and local taxes as much as they will let me do. Do you think any of those are controversial? Oh, by the way, I have the receipts for my charitable donations, right? None of those are controversial. Now, there are additional things I could do. For example, I'm starting this business out of my office, and I've got a 3D printer there, and I'm designing some really cool stuff, and I'm going to 3D print and sell on Etsy. In theory, what could I do with that space in my house? Yeah, I could write it off. My wife has her own deal on the side, right? Professors always do. My wife has her own deal on the side. That area where she works on that thing, guess what I could do? I could also write that off. Do you know why I don't? It's a conservatism thing, right? What do you think is most likely to trip an audit? The home office is one of them, right? So as a company, what I'm telling you is anything within the law that you can do that doesn't raise the risk of the IRS getting all up in your stuff is stuff that you want to do. And so it's this, the law is the basement of ethics, right? Okay, tax evasion on the other hand, it's where we're getting paid in cash and we don't report the income, that sort of stuff. Does that make sense? You guys ever go to it's been a while since this happened to me, but you go to a Chinese restaurant and when you pull out your credit card there, you're like, why do you think they're so disappointed? I'll give you a hint, it's not the 2.5% swipe fee, right? Okay. And the same could be true with any kind of restaurant. So let's talk about the summary of our discussion with no taxes. We said that the value of the levered firm was identical to the value of the unlevered firm in a world with no taxes. That's Modigliani and Miller Proposition 1. And and how do we know that to be true? Do you guys remember homemade leverage and homemade unleverage? We said that any Tom, Dick, or Harry in their personal account can replicate the cash flows from a levered firm or from an unlevered firm, starting with the other one. And so any pattern of leverage that the shareholder desires, they can create it on their own. And so if you can create something on your own, are you going to pay any extra for that from someone else? No. And so that's why we say the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the unlevered firm in a world without taxes. And Proposition 2, in a world with no taxes, says that the required return for shareholders increases linearly with the debt to equity ratio because it increases the risk to the shareholders. And let me demonstrate to you one more time. If you have a firm with no debt whatsoever, what's the possibility of them going bankrupt? 0, right? But as you start to add in additional debt, that probability of bankruptcy goes up. Holding the equity in that firm becomes a riskier proposition. You remember that line that starts to go like this as we add it's got a steeper slope. It's got to be riskier. Okay, so that's in a world without taxes. Now let's talk about the world with taxes, and then we will talk about implications and what goes on in reality. We said that the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the unlevered firm plus the present value of these tax shields going forward. What would be the implication of that? We mentioned it earlier, that if you wanted to maximize the value of the levered firm, what do? Yeah, you just keep taking on more and more debt, right? Now, do we see that in the real world? And the answer is no. In fact, what we see is, based on industry differences, we see differences in the ideal capital structure. By the way, let me ask you this question. Would you loan money to a firm that was running 90% debt, 10% equity? Mr. Stitt says no, and Mr. McCrander says no. Anybody else say no to that? Yeah, so we got, like, whoa, they're in debt up to their eyeballs, not gonna loan them money. Now let me ask this same group of, I think it was just these three folks here that answered. Do you have money in the bank?
Yeah.
You are loaning to someone with a 90% total debt ratio, because that's how banks work. By the way, when you make a deposit to the bank, you are loaning them money. That is a liability to the bank. Does that make sense? And then they're running on 90% debt and 10% equity. In essence, you are loaning money to someone with this debt ratio that you just told me is not good. Now the question becomes, why does it work at banks? And the answer has to do with something that we call the trade-off theory. And we'll get to it more in a future chapter. But here's the general idea between the trade-off theory. If Proposition 1 with taxes is true, it says that we should take on a bunch of debt. But we don't see that in reality. So there has to be some sort of counterbalance. And that counterbalance is the expected cost of financial distress. The expected cost. Remember we talked about SWAGs? An expected value is the probability of something happening times the value if it does happen, right? And so what we're looking at here is the probability of bankruptcy times the cost if bankruptcy occurs. We really can't put a good number on the cost of bankruptcy, but we can talk about probabilities of bankruptcy. Banks have a relatively low probability of bankruptcy because, except for Silicon Valley Bank, they have a relatively low probability of bankruptcy because they have usually well-diversified portfolios of loans. Do you think they only make loans to construction companies? No. Do you think they only make loans to car lots? No. Do you think they only make loans to pizza bakers, to pizza makers? No. And so basically they are spread out across a lot of different industries, and if they're smart, they're spreading out over geographical areas too, and that diversifies their portfolio of loans. What is riskier, an undiversified portfolio or a diversified portfolio? Yeah, the undiversified. If you don't believe me, ask the people at Silicon Valley Bank, right? They had an undiversified portfolio and it bit them on the ass. But if you go to, say, Central Bank of the Ozarks, do you think their portfolio is undiversified like that? Absolutely not. And that's why, because the risk of bankruptcy is so low because of their exposure to the entire economy, that they can get by with this rate that they do on their capital structure, 90% debt, 10% equity. Now let's talk about a different industry. What about electric utilities? You guys know what an electric utility is? They produce electricity, sell it to you. City Utilities is our local electric utility here. Their cash flows, by the way, the steadiness of the cash flows are important. Remember I talked about being a government employee and how steady my cash flows were? My probability of bankruptcy is much lower than someone who has the same expected salary every year, but it jumps around from month to month. When we look at electric utilities, we see that their cash flows jump around more than banks. Banks' income is contractually, they've got contracts, right? Do you think the electric utility company has a contract with you as to how much electricity you're going to consume? No. And do they even, can they model based on the weather how much electricity is going to be consumed? Yeah. Is the model correct? No. right? It's a swag. And so what I'm telling you here is that not only are the cash flows different seasonally, because say in summertime, you're gonna be cranking out a lot of electricity because of air conditioning. In the wintertime, not so much. And so the cash flows are not only seasonal, but they are also more varied. Because what if we had a cool summer? What if we had a warmer winter, right? Then the utilities aren't gonna do as well. Does that make sense? And so what I'm telling you is that an electric utility has a higher probability of bankruptcy than a bank. As a result, they've got a higher expected cost of financial distress. As a result, they are not going to have as much debt in their capital structure. The trade-off, balancing out that additional benefit of debt versus the additional expected cost of financial distress, that balance point happens much lower, 50%. Now, let's talk about a third kind of company. Do you guys know what biotech firms are? Biotechnology, what do they do? Innovation. Now, when you start off doing, so let's say that you're trying to come up with a blockbuster drug. What percentage of drugs do you think make it all the way to the finish line and become blockbusters? Yeah, it's tiny, right? Probably only 5% actually get approved, and an even smaller percentage of those are actual what we would call blockbuster drugs. And you guys know what the blockbuster drugs are. It varies by the time frame, right? Now, let's think about if you are a biotechnology firm. You are doing research. And so we're over here in period 0, and we have to raise a bunch of money. Do people, will they buy equity in our firm, or are they going to loan us money?
Equity.
Yeah, it's got to be equity, and here's why. Because this is what the cash flows at a biotech look like. Are you ready? Lose money, lose money, lose money, lose money, lose money, lose money. By the way, all this time I'm losing money. Am I able to make debt payments? No, I got no cash flow, right? So I start off with this $10 million worth of equity. They give me the money, and now I'm spending that $10 million and hoping something happens before I run out. What am I hoping for? Yeah, the breakthrough. Lose money, lose money, lose money. Breakthrough, right? Now what happens? We sell the idea, and then that money can get distributed to the shareholders because it's their money, right? And what do we go back to doing? Lose money, lose money, lose money, lose money. What do you think the debt to equity ratio at a biotech firm looks like? It's got to be
1% debt.
oh well.
Maybe.
Yeah, if you count the current liabilities, perhaps, you know, what I owe to the power company or whatever. But typically, we're looking at right at zero. Right at zero. And so what I'm telling you is that we see that this Proposition 1 with taxes is not really true, because there is this countervailing force of the expected cost of financial distress. But keep in mind, I'm kind of walking you through the theory and how we got to where we are today. So don't be too freaked out by it. Now, does that mean that there is no value in the tax shield? Of course there's value, but there's just something that we have to balance out against that. Okay, and then we also see that the required return on equity is lower in a world with taxes. This is kind of a bizarre outcome. Think about if the tax rate goes up, what happens to the required return on the equity? If the tax rate goes up, what happens to 1 minus T sub C? It goes down. And what happens to that second chunk over there? It goes down. And then the left-hand chunk stays the same, and so the required return on the stock actually is lower with higher taxes. And here's why. Because with higher taxes, your debt shield is worth more. Remember this? This is the present value of the tax shield of debt. Notice that it's higher the higher the tax rate is. Does that make sense? That's why this required return for equity is lower the higher that tax rate goes in a world with taxes. Questions? Okay. That is the end of the slide. So we talked about, we've done this, we talked about the implications, and that the implication of the proposition 1 in a world with taxes is that we would take on all the debt in the world. But in reality, do we see people doing that? No. That's because of this trade-off with the expected cost of financial distress. Now, I think we've got a little time to work some examples. Have any of you, actually, I'm going to point something out to you. It's kind of embarrassing. We're going to go, let's see, PowerPoint files, chapter 14. We're going to go here to the practice. Any of you guys have any idea how many students in this class have even looked at this? Ooh, one. We've had one person look at this. See that? One student in progress, 15 students have not yet started. By the way, we're down to, oh, wait a minute, have we got someone dropped again? I'll have to check into that. Okay, so here we go. The actual problems start at number 44. By the way, is there any excuse for you to miss any of the conceptual questions? I've given you 43 practice multiple choice questions. There's no excuse. Well, Money Imports is an unlevered firm. Let's see if I can make this bigger. With a total market value of $240,000 and 8,000 shares of stock outstanding. The firm has expected EBIT of 15,000 if the economy is normal, and 27,000 if the economy booms. The firm is considering a bond issue of $63,000 with an attached interest rate of 7.5%. The bond proceeds will be used to repurchase shares. Ignore taxes. What will be the earnings per share after the repurchase if the economy booms? Oh man, there's a lot to unpack there. First thing, it's an unlevered firm. Is there any debt? No. And so we know that total market value is therefore equal to the total equity. We've got 240,000 in total equity. We have 8,000 shares outstanding. What is my cost per share? What is my share price? How much? $30. Very good. How'd you get that?
240 divided by.
Yeah, 240,000 divided by 8,000, or we could just say 240 over 8 gives us $30 per share. Now they're going to issue $63,000 worth of debt. How many shares can you buy with $63,000 if the shares are worth $30 a piece?
2,100.
Yeah, 2,100. And in fact, it says it right there. So 2,100 shares. So we started off with 8,000 shares. And now we're buying back 2,100 shares. What does that leave us with? What's 8,000 minus 2,100?
5,900.
Yeah, 5,900 shares. And so that's the number of shares we're going to be dividing our net income by to get our earnings per share. Now let's talk about the EBIT. They're asking what will be if the economy booms. What is the EBIT in a booming economy according to the problem?
27,000.
27,000. Now I have to subtract out the interest. How much is the interest that we're looking at here? How would I find the amount of interest?
7.5% times the 63,000.
Yeah, 7.5% times $63,000. How much is that? .075 times 63,000 equals 4,725. Is that what you get? Now, do they say anything? Oh, no, they say ignore taxes. It's 0. And so what we're really saying here is that our net income is equal to 27,000 minus 4725. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit my plus minus key, and I'm going to add $27,000. I'm getting 22,275. Is that what you get? Is that what you get? Okay. Now, one last step to get EPS. Can anyone tell me what we need to do? Yeah, divide by the shares. So I'm going to say 275 divide by 5,900. So all I'm going to do here is say divide by 5,900. And I'm getting $3.78 a share, just like they did. How many steps were in that problem? I lost count, right? Too many times students come to me, especially my MBA students, and they're like, well, we just, if I'm asking for ROA, they want me to give them net income and they want me to give them total assets, and they're just going to plug it in. No, that's not the way life works. It's a multi-step process, right? And so it takes us more than one step to be able to solve these things. By the way, what do you think is going to determine your ability to finish within the time limit of the exam, 75 minutes?
Practice.
Yeah, practice and practice on the calculations. Practice on the calculations, familiarity with your TI-BA2 plus. That's where you build your speed, right? Questions before I move on?
Would this be a bad move to do because the earnings per share go down?
Well, keep in mind, that's a good question.
Granted, I think you're market rate.
Well, keep in mind that we're looking at the total value of the firm. We could have,
I don't think the earnings per share does go.
so did we figure it to begin with?
Yeah, we did.
We did not.
And if you're taking
That's your price per share.
175 by 8,
Yeah.
that's not even 3.5.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up. Other questions? Okay, next one. Core Resources is an unlevered firm with a market value of $460,000. Okay, this is the same problem with different numbers, so we're going to skip it. You guys should do it. This is the same problem with different numbers. Do you think it's great I give you the same problem with different numbers? Yeah. By the way, when you take the exam, do you think it'll just be the same problem with different numbers? Okay, VU Games and Game On are identical firms except for their capital structures. VU Games is an unlevered firm with $680,000. Game On is a levered firm with $425,000 and $255,000 in debt. Interest rate is 6.2%. Both VU Games and Game On have an expected EBIT of $84,000. Ignore taxes, and then they want us to give the WACC. So the WACC should be the same for both firms because the underlying assets are the same. Does that make sense? Okay, and so they're telling us that you're making $84,000 on $680,000 worth of equity. So we could just take that 84,000, divide by 68,000, and that will give us 12.35%. Now let me explain why that works. Remember, we're looking at the return on the underlying assets, and all the assets here are funded using what? Equity, right? And so in this case, the required return on the equity is exactly the same thing as the required return on the assets. That return is 84,000 divided by 680,000, 12.35%. Now that we know that, we can, well, we'll get there in a minute. So, VU Games has a WAC of 12.35%. Now, what about Game On? Remember, if you've got your sheet here, did I put it on there? No, I did not. I guess I do. The required, look at Proposition 2 of corporate taxes. At the very bottom. R sub S is equal to R sub 0 plus B over S. By the way, R sub 0 is the same as R WAC. And so for R sub 0, we're going to put in that 12.30%, 0.1235. And then the debt to equity ratio. Well, they tell us there's $255,000 worth of debt, $425,000 worth of equity. So that's why we've got 255 divided by 425, multiply by write that down wrong? Oh, no. Multiply by R sub 0 minus R sub B. So R sub 0, once again, is at 12.35%. What is R sub B?
It's the interest.
Yeah, it's the interest rate. And so we know that interest rate, they tell us, is what, 6.2% or 0.062. And so we're looking at Proposition 2, no taxes here, because they told us to ignore taxes. And so that formula right there is exactly what we're plugging into. And when we do all of that in there, we get 16.04% for the required return on Game On. Now, if we threw that into the WAC equation, what we would find is that the WAC is identical to the other firm. Actually, I would not have even, once I got to the first one on this, would I have gone to the second one? Not at all. But what if there were taxes involved? Then I would. Does that make sense? If there are no taxes involved, the WAC of the unlevered firm is exactly the same as the WAC of the levered firm.
Would that mean that the unlevered firm, if taxes were involved, it would be lower than 12.35?
No. It would mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry, I was messed up there. Yes.
Okay.
Because of the 1 minus T sub C, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we've seen that one before with different numbers. A firm has a debt to equity ratio of 1.5, an unlevered WAC of 12.35%, and a pre-tax cost of debt of 6.5%. What is the levered cost of equity if there are no taxes or other imperfections? Which formula should I be using off this sheet? No taxes, so you know it's going to be one of the top two. And they're wanting to know the return or the levered cost of equity. That's got this required return on equity of the levered firm. Which formula are we going to use here? Come on, guys. Yeah, it's going to be Proposition 2, no taxes. R sub S is what we're looking for, is equal to R sub 0. What are we going to put in for R sub 0 there? Yeah, the unlevered WAC, 12.35%. Pre-tax cost of debt, that is R sub B, right? And they actually give us the debt to equity ratio. So that's, we're just going to plug in 1.5 where it says B over S, and that's going to give us the formula. That's all we have time for today. Now, what are you guys supposed to do before we come next time? Practice, homework, and you're going to write down questions that you want to see me work in class. That's what I'm going to do next time. Okay, have a good weekend.